I want all the kids that are listening to Everyday Truth to listen really, really carefully today, because I want to talk to you about something really important. Now, Mom and Dad, I really would wish that you would listen in as well, because this will be helpful. So I hope you'll listen today. God bless you as you join us in Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 3.
Welcome to Everyday Truth with Kurt Skelly. We believe the Bible is true and relevant to everyone, everywhere, every day. If today's conversation is a help to you, take a moment to leave a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening. Now, let's join Kurt for today's episode.
Hey friends, welcome back to today's episode of Everyday Truth. So glad you joined us and looking forward to jumping into a brand new chapter today. In fact, it is our last chapter in this little book, and hard to believe that we are already here. But hope you've enjoyed the series and really looking forward to how it really winds up as we get into the spiritual battle that we all face. And think about it. We're talking about family, and we're talking about marriage and children and work relationships and really all of what encompasses life. And then we jump into the spiritual warfare that is evident and real all around us. And think about it. That's what happens. We deal with the physical world and our physical relationships, but really what's at stake here is our spiritual lives and this unseen world that's all around us. Can't wait to get into that. But we're in Ephesians 6 right now, and I want you to look at verse number 1, very familiar verse for most of us. It says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth." So, first of all, context. And sometimes we miss context in the Bible because we allow chapter divisions to be barriers, and we should not do that. Understanding that when the apostle penned these words as a letter to the church at Ephesus, there was no chapter and verse division. This was just one letter, which, by the way, was meant to be read in one sitting. So the context would have been much more evident to the initial audience than it is sometimes to us who tend to chop it up a little bit. And not to say that we shouldn't take time and deal with individual verses, but what I do want to emphasize is that we should always be thinking about the larger context. So the larger context of verses 1 through 3 is the context of spirit fullness. Remember, we talked about being filled with the Spirit, being controlled by the Spirit of God. We talked about those evidences. And then we jumped right into how does that apply to marriage? How does that apply specifically to a wife or to a husband? And we talked about that those roles are impossible to fulfill, at least to the degree that the Lord expects for us to fulfill them, without His empowerment, without His control in our life. So spirit fullness is the context. And when we jump into now verse number 1 of chapter 6, children, obey your parents, that's still in the context of the fullness of the Spirit. So can a child, this is a good question, can a child be controlled by God's Spirit? And the answer is, of course, and they ought to be. In fact, I would say this, that it is not an adult that serves as the example to children for how to be yielded and to have faith in God, but it's the exact opposite. It's a child that's used as an example for adults. So except you have the faith of this child, you shall in no wise enter into. So the point here is this, that salvation is available to those who understand that they are sinners, who are willing to repent and believe. and to exhibit that humility to come to Christ alone for salvation. Well, the same thing can be said about spirit fullness. That spirit fullness is a matter of yielding to the indwelling Spirit of God inside of us, allowing Him to do in our lives what we could never do ourselves. So children ought to be those who walk with God. And don't ever think that your child, and you might be a child right now listening. I've met many of you that are listening with mom and dad on your way to school. Maybe right now you're listening. I'm thinking about some of you right now that I've met. And you ought to walk with the Lord. You're 7 years old. You're 11 years old. You're a teenager. Listen, you ought to be walking with the Lord. And a great evidence of being yielded to the Spirit of God, allowing God to work in your life, is the way that you deal with your parents. And so the Bible says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Now, can I add one more contextual part to this? And that is, what parents are children to obey? Now, they're to obey their parents no matter what. But in the context of Ephesians 6, who are the parents that they're obeying? Well, a spirit-filled mom and a spirit-filled dad. Now, that's not to say, kids, that if mom and dad aren't living for the Lord, that you have the right to disobey them. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying that is the ideal family is when you have a mom and dad who love each other and love the Lord and are fulfilling their biblical roles. Then children obey those parents in the Lord. That is a godly family. And that, parents, is a way by which to provide a great environment for your kids. In fact, I've said it this way so often, and that is, the very best thing that you can do for any other person in your family, and think about this statement, the very best thing you can do for any other person in your family is for you to be right with God yourself. So your vertical relationship is absolutely imperative to the health of your horizontal relationships. So keep that in mind. So with all of that said, let's go back to verse number 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Remember, we talked about the institutions that God has ordained, the home and human government and the church, and we talked about the authority structure in each one of them. So it is in the home. That in the home, you have an authority structure, and the husband is the governmental head of the home. The wife is his partner in that, and together they communicate, they serve the Lord, with the husband having the final authority because he has the greater accountability before the Lord. But together as parents, they are raising children. They ought to do so in unanimity with great communication, not allowing children to play one off on the other, but there ought to be an agreement, right? And so children, obey your parents. Obey that unit that God has given you for your protection and for your guidance in the Lord. Remember, we talked about the caveat of submission for a wife to a husband, that she obeys him as she obeys the Lord. And the point there is, it's bigger than just providing guardrails, but I think it also speaks to motivation, that I would submit to my husband the same way I'd submit to the Lord. And I would obey my parents the same way I don't obey the Lord. So I think there's motivation, but I think there's also parameter. And the point here is this: what if I am told by my authority to do something that violates my obedience to God, my obedience to Christ? And the answer is we obey the higher power. A great example of that would be Peter and John. Remember, Peter and John were told by the authorities not to preach Jesus Christ, but they had a greater command from the Lord himself, and that was to be witnesses in all Jerusalem and Judea. So what do we do when the command of one comes in conflict with the command of another? Well, we have to look at who is the greater commander. And that's the point. So, children, obey your parents in the Lord. And I love this, for this is right. This is right. And the word right is just a shortened form of the word righteousness. This is the right way. This is the righteousness, the way we deal with other people. So when you think about holiness, that's a word that speaks to our relationship with God. When you think about righteousness or justice, these are words that typically relate to our relationship with other people. Now, obviously, it's always a relationship with the Lord, but relating to the Lord as we relate rightly with other people. So, what's the best way for a child to relate rightly with the Lord? It's by obeying his parents. So, obey your parents in the Lord. This is right. And then beyond obedience, there is the concept of honoring. Why? Because children aren't always under the governmental headship of their parents. There comes a time when they take a wife to themselves as boys, or a husband, they marry a husband as girls. So all my children are married. So they have their own homes and they have their own unit. But that does not exempt them from the responsibility to honor their father and mother. And so honoring is the lifetime relationship, which we honor and obey, and then obedience gives way to honor, right? Because there comes a time where you just can't tell them what to do. Even though sometimes you want to, you can't. But there never comes a time when there should be a dishonoring. So honor thy father and mother. And I like what it says here because there's an incentive. Do you see it in verse number 2? Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. Here is the promise, verse number 3, that it may be well with thee and thou mayest live long on the earth. So first of all, that's a general principle. So it doesn't mean that people that die young, they didn't honor their parents. John the Baptist must have been really, really bad to his mom and dad because he died young. That's not the point. The point here as a general rule is the kind of children that live in obedience, the kind of children that honor moms and dads, which means they are humble, they're looking for advice, they are not rash in their decision making. These principles are going to manifest themselves in longevity and in health and in wellness, both physically, probably financially, socially. Why? Because that's the way that God works. He works in and through healthy families. That's why in Malachi chapter 4, at the end of the Old Testament, the curse was that fathers and children would be disaffected from each other. And that before Christ would come, that Elijah would have to come to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. Why? Because that nuclear relationship, husband and wife, parents and children, really is the basis of the success of any larger institution, whether that be a local church or whether that be a nation and the government that guides and governs that nation. It's important to start at the foundational levels. And the foundational level is marriage, Ephesians 5:23 through the end of the chapter, and then marriage and children, the family. And that's mom and dad and children in a respectful, honoring, obedient relationship. Now, we'll talk very specifically, because we talked about this relationship, children to parents. Okay, but next episode, I'll probably just cover one verse because it's that important. And we'll talk about the relationship of specifically fathers, but I think by extension, parents, to children. So children, parents, God always starts with the one that's under authority first. So wives, and then husbands, and then children, and then parents. So we'll talk about parents, especially you dads. We'll talk about that next episode. Hope you'll join us for that. God bless you, my friends.